So let's get this underway. Welcome again to the third of the 2014 Edwin O. Reischauer Memorial Lectures. I'm Mark Elliott, director of the Fairbanks Center, and this is the crowning piece, the pièce de résistance of this year's lectures given by Nancy Steinhardt of the University of Pennsylvania. Our first lecture, the 6th century as the 7th and 8th, a revisionist look at the origins, the real origins of classical Chinese architecture in the pre-Tang period. Yesterday's lecture on the Liao, showing us the kind of monumental style that the Liao brought to their image of imperial China that they create in the very northern part of the country. And then today on the Yuan, shifting the borders, as you see, a revisionist history of Yuan architecture. Now, yesterday in Eugene Wang's comments, he made reference to one of the enigmas or puzzles that comes out of the study of the relationship between interaction between Inner Asia and China. There are a number of these. One of them has always been the question or the riddle of how it is that a people, whether in the case of the Khitans or the Jurchens or the Mongols or the Manchus, a people so few in number manage to organize themselves so well that they are able to build the kind of empires that they built, including either part of or all of China, even when they were vastly outnumbered on the ground by Han Chinese, or by the Hua people. This is one of the eternal, I think, real mysteries of the whole Huayi Zhibian, the Huayi, the China and so-called barbarian tension that has driven so much of East Asian history over the last 2,300 years or so. And Eugene's question for us yesterday was, how is it that a people who had no building tradition whatsoever, who didn't even live in buildings, suddenly are masters of making fantastic structures, larger than anything that we have left over? And maybe there were bigger buildings built before the Liao. We don't know. Nancy knows. I don't know. Where did that come from? Where did that impulse come from? Where did the resources come from? The know-how? And what sort of imprint did Inner Asian styles, did Inner Asian notions of rulership or emperorship leave upon the architectural record, whether this be seen in terms of individual buildings or in complexes of buildings, including cities? Eugene raised this question for us, this question I've often thought about. Nancy's thought about it probably longer than any of us here. Her dissertation was, of course, on the Yuan capital of Dadu, on the site, more or less, of modern Beijing. And here we get both of these riddles in one. Again, a people who never lived in buildings. They built these buildings, but they didn't live in them. As far as we know, Kublai lived in a yurt that he built in the palace precincts, surrounded by all these wonderful buildings, but he didn't actually live in them. And I have to say, having spent a little bit of time, not a lot of time, but a little bit of time in Mongolia, I kind of understand him, because you get to Ulaanbaatar, say, and you're in your hotel room, and it's a regular hotel room, like a hotel room anywhere, with 4 walls, everything at 90 degrees. And then you leave, and you go out, and you're staying in gurs, because there are no hotels anywhere else in Mongolia except in Ulaanbaatar. So you stay in gurs, and gurs are, of course, round. And you stay in a round gur for a couple of weeks, and life is good. And you come back to the city, and everything is square and pointy and sharp and angular and unfriendly. I felt this quite personally. I don't know if others who've traveled around Mongolia have had this experience or not. So I can kind of understand why Kublai didn't want to give up the comfort of the yurt, the welcoming roundness, the lack of corners that a gur provides. So the Mongols have this, again, absence of an architectural tradition that they then take to build one of the great cities of East Asia. And not the only one. We have another great city in Karakoram, of course, the archaeology of which we barely understand right now. And they also organize so well such a small number of people, a couple of million, that they basically take over the whole world. This is a mystery that will never cease, I think, to fascinate people, not just in the study of East Asia, but people who study world history. So we're going to get more answers, I think, more parts of this puzzle in today's lecture on Yuan architecture. We will be helped along in this venture by, again, two discussants, again, from different disciplines, art historian Wei-Chung Lin of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Professor Janet Gyatso of the Harvard Divinity School, who will provide comments. I'll say a little bit more about them when I introduce them in 45 minutes or an hour or so once Nancy has concluded. So, Nancy, it's all yours.
The lights will come down, right? All right, today's the conclusion. In order to have a revisionist history, there must first be a history. And we have a fairly comprehensive history of Yuan architecture, which I shall define as buildings constructed during the period when the Mongols ruled China, that is 1267, the year that Kublai broke ground for his great capital Dadu, to 1368, when the Ming Dynasty establishes itself in the city of Nanjing. I don't have a number of buildings that exist from the Yuan dynasty, but there are at least 300 wooden buildings, plus there are buildings in other materials. There are at least 70 tombs with murals, many, many more than that number without murals. There are rock-carved caves, both with relief sculpture and murals, that span from Hangzhou in the southeast to Dunhuang in the west. I shall begin with a brief history of what I will call the standard history of Yuan architecture, what one might read in a book, in a Chinese survey book. I'll then make a few comments about cities because they relate to issues that we discussed yesterday, and they're the backdrop for some of the buildings that we're looking at today. And then I'm going to talk about buildings that you are likely not to have seen, the buildings that write an expanded, perhaps alternate, if not revisionist history of architecture during the period of Mongolian rule in China. You're looking on the screen at what I would call a representative view of core Yuan buildings. We'll see this one many times today, the hall for sacrifices to the northern peak in Hebei province, built around the year 1270, murals inside. This one, perhaps the best known, especially to art historians, the Hall of the Three Purities at the Taoist monastery Yonglogong, with hundreds of meters of murals inside. A pavilion that stood at the crossroads of a small town, today it's in Dingxing, Hebei province, built in the year 1306. Now I come down here, Dragon King Temple. I use the word temple because it is Taoist. It's on the grounds of a Buddhist monastery, also filled with murals, still in situ, along the Fun River in southern Shanxi, the date 1319. A building from the southeast, from Yanfu Monastery in Zhejiang Province, built in 1317, and a village temple in Boai County of Henan. This is an example of a building that I came to find with a newsprint picture and found in 2005 that it had been completely restored, and the person who showed it to me was very proud of the restoration. But then what we have across here, only 3 of the almost countless buildings in Shanxi province. These are not published as far as I know. They are almost not known. They all date to the Yuan dynasty. They are, at least one of them is registered as a cultural property in China. They have murals. They have sculpture. There's a long history of Yuan yet to be written. Then, so we've been in just now 4 provinces and North and South China. Then there are the walled cities and towns, the capital Shangdu on the left, known to some of you as Xanadu, the city begun by Kublai's order in 1256 in Dolan County of Inner Mongolia, the city from which he would make his bid for control of a Mongol empire to be centered in China. Kublai's great capital on the right, Dadu, it would be the showcase of Mongol rule in Asia. built largely from 1267, begun a little bit before then, through his life, and to a certain extent after him. Less well known, the short-lived central capital, it will be important to us later, it was begun by the 7th Mongol ruler, Kaishan, who sought to build a city, his own royal city, approximately midway between Dadu and Chengdu. He comes to the throne in 1308, he dies in 1311, and so only limited construction. The wall was completed, 3 walls were completed, that's what you see in the plan. It was a standard Chinese 3-walled city. The inner wall, 2,360 meters in perimeter, with a 15-meter thick wall, so clearly a very fortified city. And remains from the city include the kind of animal-headed architectural decoration. These are from the central capital. These are the kinds of sculptures that one sees from Chengdu and also from Karakoram. 4 more examples of Mongol cities. The one on the top left, Anshi Wangfu. This is the city for the prince of Anshi. It was built for a man named Mongala or Mongolai, one of Kublai's sons. And this is the city, I just shrunk it. This is the city where the famous magic square with Arabic was excavated. It's beneath, or it's partially excavated within the walls of the city of Xi'an today, or within the Ming walls, within the confines of the city of Xi'an today. Second, on the top right, a city built for another one of Kublai's children, Princess Senge. Senge, the one with the famous painting collection, built in 1270, before Dadu was even finished. Lower right, Al-Malik, also known as Ili or Huachang. The walls don't remain today, but you'll see why this is important. And then on the right, Olonsume, a city first that became known in the West through writings of Owen Lattimore. It's about 40 kilometers from what's known as Damao-Chi. If you've read Owen Lattimore and you've heard about him looking for the monastery Bailing Miao, he saw this when he was there. It was occupied by men and women of the Church of the East, the group that people sometimes call Nestorians, believed to be the city of Alakush Tegan Kuri of the Onguts, destroyed at the end of the Yuan dynasty, rebuilt under Altan Khan in the Ming. So the Mongols are often credited with destroying walled cities. They certainly destroyed cities, but they also very rapidly and seriously built walled cities and towns, and there are many more than I'm showing you here that are in today's Mongolia or Russia, especially along the Kirchura River. Then there are the buildings through which we write our revisionist history. We start at the top, Dongfeng, Henan province, near the sacred central peak that came up in the first lecture, the Yuan Observatory. Continuing on the top, 2 of the mosques, I will say just a few things about mosques today. Some of you heard me talk about mosques last year here. The famous white pagoda built by Kublai's order. The person in charge of it was a Nepali whose name is Anige. A building here I don't think that you've seen, a mausoleum, a stage, a ritual site that the Mongols used, the oldest house in China, in Shanxi province. The daughter of the owner definitely did not want me to get in, but I have her picture in front of the house also. Very recently, another house has come up, also in Shanxi province, also believed to be from the Yuan dynasty. And then on the far right, a central pillar cave. There are several initial points to draw from these images. First, the diversity of Yuan architecture. Not only is this range not available for any earlier period, seen together, the groups indicate that individual buildings were part of the mainstream of Chinese construction, that cities connect with walled cities and towns in Mongolia and in Russia. And although, as I mentioned, the Mongols destroyed cities, they continued to build them. That Yuan is a period when we can talk about Chinese and Lamaist Buddhism and Taoism and Islam and Christianity through architectural remains, that Yuan is a time when we observe clear distinctions between construction for the top echelons of society and those who lived and worshipped humbly in villages and towns, that Yuan is a period when we can talk about the life of the populace in those villages and towns, where they lived, where they prayed, where they watched performances. Perhaps we can even talk about popular culture through architecture during the Yuan period. China offered a powerful vision of urbanism and architecture for horsemen approaching from the north. I had to show one picture like this. We see it today. I think I took this from the movie Mongol, but this is, you just heard about it. This is what we always envision, the peoples from the north coming and seeing the walls and the roofs projecting over the gates. The Mongols saw it not only in Mongolia, as we saw yesterday when we looked at Khitan architecture, and cities. This is the Mongols surely saw these walls that we looked at yesterday, but they also saw what had been immediately built just up to the time of conquest in their own conquest. They saw what the Tanguts or the Xixia had built on the left. They saw what the Jurchen had built on the right. Those two groups, the Xixia or Tanguts and the Jurchen, like the Khitan and like many others who had come before them, as well as the Japanese who we looked at on Tuesday, had appropriated Chinese architecture in their own processes of confederation and empire formation, and the Mongols would follow their precedents. The Mongols, of course, as we also mentioned yesterday, were different from each previous group who had confronted these images on horseback and aspired to rule a Chinese throne. One important reason, of course, is because the empire would stretch from the Black Sea to the East China Sea. But it's important to emphasize other differences in the study of the Mongols compared to the Jurchen or the Khitan or the Tanguts or the Koreans or the Japanese, and that is because by the time we get to the Mongol period, the Mongols were painted and described by Europeans. We have a very different kind of record. I emphasized yesterday that we don't really have good pictures of what the Khitan looked like or the Jurchen looked like. But Europeans, some of whom saw Mongols and others who just heard about them, gave us these images. So that if ever there was a moment when Chinese architecture should have been altered by foreign influences, when new kinds of buildings should have emerged, it was this century between 1267 and 1368, and for the most part, it did not happen. It didn't happen even though images of the world made under Mongolian rule reflect or even anticipate that there would be a change. Ju Sabun mapped the world between 1311 and 1320. His own maps don't survive, but they were reprinted in the Ming Dynasty, and you see two different pictures of Mongolia. You see both Eastern and Western. Chun Yuanjing of the Southern Sung wrote an encyclopedia, a record of a forest of affairs, Shilin Guangji, in the Southern Sung dynasty. As I said, it was reissued in the 14th century when people now wore the dress of the Mongols, but when we also find the Xixia, not the farthest place south, and we find Chengdu, you might be able to see it better than I do, and we find the Great Wall, and we know that China is very aware that the world beyond them exists. Buildings require large sums of money and land. Even a stage requires an organized labor force. When the Mongols or anyone at or beyond China's borders built walls and buildings inspired by China, history confirmed for them that those structures would outlive them. The decision to build as China in the 6th or the 11th or the 12th or the 13th or the 14th centuries was conscious and it was political. We have, for our standard history of the Yuan dynasty, both a clear hierarchy of the timber frame tradition, and then we have very specific features that define a Yuan building, more than we have that define a building for any time before this. You're looking on the left at Yuan China's largest building, and just by comparison, it's only 40 meters across the front. What we looked at yesterday were nearly 60 meters across the front, one a little over 50 and one much more. Not China's largest building, but an eminent structure, a diantang, according to the rules that we have talked about. There also now for the Yuan dynasty are texts that describe buildings, including buildings in Kublai's city Dadu. Two of them are extremely important. Tao Zongyi in the Chua Gonglu gives us a description of the palaces of Dadu written in the 1250s, presumably based on texts that he had. And Xiaoxuan on the right, more interesting in some ways, an official under the man who would become the Yongle emperor, in 1396 is charged with describing the buildings that survive from the Yuan dynasty before they're torn down to make way for rebuilding what Yongle already envisioned would be his capital city, or the capital of China. The text is called Gu Gongyi Lu, Record of the Remains of the Imperial City or of the Palace City. When we look at something when we look at Yuan China's grandest building, the hall to the northern peak, Virtuous Tranquility Hall from the temple to the northern peak, and I take a passage from Xiaoxuan, you can see now what the texts make it possible to do. So I'm talking about the Daming Hall, not the Daning Hall. This was the hall of audience that Kublai Khan himself used. Xiaoxuan tells us, it is raised on a platform. In front is the stairway. Surrounding the hall is a marble balustrade carved with figures of dragons and phoenixes. Each vertical post of the balustrade rests on an owl, a sea dragon-like creature. A better view of what one of these is at the corner on the left, and on the right, a piece of relief sculpture from Dadu. Every outside pillar of the hall is decorated with, a few more examples of our owl, and on the bottom you see two from Shangdu, and I showed you two from the central capital at the beginning. Continuing, every outside pillar of the hall is decorated with raised flowers, golden dragons, and clouds, on top of which are carved decoration. Here I turn to one of the eminent halls, Diantang, I looked at yesterday, the Sage Mother Hall, where we certainly have dragons entwined around the pillars, and we envision Kublai's hall have the same kinds of things. In the center of the ceiling is a pair of coiling dragons. It's precisely what we have in the hall for sacrifices to the northern peak. On all four sides of the hall are golden and red mullioned windows with gold leaf attached to the intervening spaces. We don't have any gold leaf. We don't know whether there was or wasn't at this building. When I bring a few more Yuan buildings into the discussion, we can isolate 5 features that define a Yuan hall. So, Virtuous Tranquility Hall, different lighting, the color somewhere between what you see here and what you saw in my previous slide, and then the other 3 buildings from the Taoist monastery, Yongle Gong, top 2 more eminent, lower 2 less eminent, as we've seen, as we talked about this yesterday. Feature number 1, 2 bracket sets between the ones on top of columns, 2 intercolumnar bracket sets. We by now have a beautiful evolution from our inverted V's in the 6th century to 1 set between the columns in the 2nd, to 2 in the Yuan dynasty, to 5 or 6 or more buildings that we see from the Forbidden City. If we even look at a sketch, ink drawing on the wall of a tomb in Inner Mongolia, the feature continues, pillar, pillar, and 2 intercolumnar bracket sets. Second, the size of bracket sets begins as approximately half of the height of the column beneath it And in the last dynasty, Qing, it's about 1/6. And here in the Yuan dynasty, this building no longer survives. 1357, it's about a fourth, or it's between a half and a sixth. And more interesting, we have this feature here, which is non-functional. The third aspect of a Yuan dynasty building is that we begin to see features that no longer have function. They're just formal, they're just decorative. So you see pieces here. This is actually what we've called a cantilever. This is just decoration. Here you're looking at a shrine that was found in a tomb in Gansu province. We have just pure decoration. And the fourth and fifth features are seen here. They're known as pillar elimination and also, well, first is pillar elimination and the second is pillar displacement. So what I mean by elimination is that you look on the inside of a Yuan building and you find positions that are marked by the columns on the outside and you don't find them inside. So we don't have our Tsai system all the time anymore. And what I mean by displacement is that in principle, if you have a pillar on the outside, you want to make sure your building stands. You're going to put a pillar every place where that's anticipated by the outside. But in the Yuan dynasty, the pillars can be displaced off these axes. This is interesting because the Ming dynasty, somebody asked a question the other day or mentioned that Liang Sicheng called Ming architecture, what did he use? Stale or repetitive or lacking in vigor. The earlier periods were lacking in vigor. This is what he meant, rigidity. So every piece of wood is rigid, very straight, and the interior of Yongluo's funerary temple has just about a complete column grid. So these open interiors and the drama very much peters out, if doesn't end, by the Yuan dynasty. Yuan is also a time when painting can support details of architecture. We looked at some extraneous evidence, paintings and relief sculpture in the first lecture, and I said that what we find is very, very specific details supported by what we now, by this point, call jiehua, ruled line painting. I am especially interested in showing you this because at Avraga, which is a site that was used by the females in Chinggis Khan's family, perhaps a palace, perhaps near where they lived with some residential or other architecture, this measuring device was found, and this is what it corresponds to. That's not to say that the Mongols were making ruled line painting, but I want to emphasize that people building in Mongolia did have measuring sticks and were certainly capable of using these devices to build architecture. In terms of what ruled line painting does for us in the Yuan dynasty, here is the approach to a platform. It's called Tadao in Chinese. This is a mansion within the confines of Dadu. Here you see in line drawings the same thing. Next, we've looked at this already, an inset, marble inset to decorate architecture with the dragon. Here it's more floral, but same position. We know the position it would have taken in a building. And this truly remarkable find on the right from the same Hoying mansion, the impression of a door, and I'm showing you a lattice door. The paintings that we've looked at are from the Taoist monastery Yonggong. So we also now have an incredible correspondence between our details and what survives. Also in the Yuan dynasty, we can now distinguish between a building in the north and a building in the south. These are all buildings from the south. I brought in one example with a better original. This was actually a photograph of a building that I wanted to find in Shanghai. This was my picture. This is what it looks like. Sometimes they're changed, but one still looks for the features that tell us they are Yuan. The building on the left we've already seen, and when we go inside either one, we find lots of curved architectural members, which is a feature we associate with South China, and we can even find it here from the year 1016. This is a building near Suzhou. This actually, it's not quite in Suzhou. There's a mistake on my label here, but it's in the south but we have enough documentary evidence to say, yeah, these curved features are something that we associate with the South. As we move down in terms of this hierarchy of the building tradition, we come to the house. I don't have anything important or illuminating to say about it other than that it is China's oldest house, and also that we can look from the highest echelons of architecture, our 7th rank, 6th rank, 5th rank, we're now down to 4th rank. The stage would be a 4th rank building, and nevertheless, we have our 2 pillars, and we have our 2 bracket sets between those pillars. Stages and drama. I made the comment in passing that perhaps we can talk about popular culture in the Yuan dynasty. Many people in this room probably recognize the images you see here. There are representations of drama in tombs from the Jurchen dynasty, not necessarily Jurchen tombs, but tombs made in China during the Jin dynasty. And there's a lot of study of stages. There are locations of 24 stages only in Shanxi province are documented. 9 of them still stand. They're all small. The most famous is the one that I've been showing you on the left from the Ox King Temple. By small, I mean it's only 7.5 meters on each side of the base. The one on the right is smaller. But again, we have the evidence to look at everything from a 7th rank building and its bracket sets down to the 4th. Now, whether emerging evidence from Mongolia will confirm anything that I've just shown you existed there is unknown. So far, what we have from Mongolia is something like this. This is in Shazankhot, and it's one of the seasonal residences of Ögedei Khan. So if you were in this field in the 1970s and you know John Boyle's articles about the seasonal residences of Ögedei Khan, this article was published in 2 different places. This is one of them, permanent materials, at least for the pillars, but the pillars actually form an octagon, and there were remains of glazed tiles, very bright green, different from the color that you see in Karakoram. I was not able to take photographs, but this will be reconstructed. And so again, we've got permanent architecture, other possible ways to expand our data about the Yuan dynasty is to talk about what I like to refer to as Korea's 3 Yuan buildings. These all date 13th and 14th century. These are also Korea's 3 oldest wooden buildings, and people have studied them, not fully, to see whether or not they include all the features of the Yuan dynasty. And then we have a very few really extraordinary ruled line paintings, particularly by a painter named Xia Yong, that give us specific details. This is the standard history, and as you can see, it's remarkably rich compared to anything that we've talked about before then. We begin our less standard or our alternate history here, revisionist history with mosques. Now, revisionist doesn't necessarily mean that we're not talking about Chinese architecture. You'll see that by the end. But mosques with buildings or good evidence of buildings in the Yuan dynasty include the 4 that you see here, all in China's coastal cities of Guangzhou, Quanzhou, Hangzhou, and Yangzhou. But they also include buildings that look like this. These are not from the Yuan dynasty, but there are buildings with Yuan sources, or there are mosques that have reason to know that there was a building there during the period of Mongolian rule. In Linxia, Gansu, founded 1273, Jining, Sichuan, founded 1295, Qingzhou, Shandong, 1302, Lin'an, not the southern Song capital, but in Yunnan, 1312, Tongzhou, a district of Beijing, 1313 to 1320. Ox Street Mosque in Beijing is even earlier. I'm not counting it here. There's also a mosque in Kaifeng that is supposed to be earlier. Songjiang in Zhejiang province, 1341. Tianshui, Gansu, 1343. East Mosque in Beijing, 1346, Dingzhou, Hebei, 1340s, and Qinyang, Hunan, founded, I believe, in the Yuan dynasty. This is the mosque I'm going to talk about because it's really not in the histories, and this is one that I would put in my own revisionist history. Great North Mosque in Qinyang, Hunan. Hunan is a heavily Hui, heavily Sinophone Muslim province. I've read that 40% of Hunan is Hui. I can't confirm that, but I've read that. The color that you're looking at here, Kongchuelan, the peacock blue tile, tells us this is an eminent structure and also not that it's not a Yuan building. The gate has a firm reconstruction date of 1799. There was a fire here in 1628, repair 1631. But there is also a stele that says the mosque was founded in the period 1341 to 1370, with continued construction from 1368 to 1424. There was also movement of the location. This is always an issue when we try to say that a building has an earlier source. There was movement, 1583 to 84, 19th century earthquake damage, repair, 1887, and also after the year 1990. Two people have published this mosque. The first is an architectural historian named Liu Zhiping, who was here in the 1960s and finally published his findings in 1985. We had a lot of examples yesterday of the lag in publications, often because of lack of support for research institutes and so on. Liu wrote that the buildings he saw were Qing, but that the mosque had an air of Ming construction, whatever an air means. In the 1990s, Lu Bingjie and Zhang Guanglin were here, and they said that they observed Ming features in the worship hall. They observed Qing restoration throughout. There certainly is Qing restoration, but I think we have something here of our 14th century mosque. So you're looking here at a section. You're looking at it from the side. You're looking at the plan, and I am most interested in this very, very, very long building axis. The roof of it is what the Chinese call a conjoined roof. This is common in mosques, especially mosques in Shandong and Hebei. And then you're going to end up right here at the minaret, which is going to have a Chinese-style roof. But when we get inside, we have a three-bay building. In other words, 1, 2, 3. So we have a courtyard with a gate, courtyard with what I would call service buildings, hall for ablutions, offices, place where the imam might live or eat, another gate, another set of service buildings, an anteroom, our mihrab. If I said minaret, I meant to say mihrab. And then we have a three-bay building, which on the exterior, from here to here, is 12 pillars. But look what you have, or I should say, look what you're missing on the inside. Pillar elimination, that's what you see here. When you look at the bracket sets, these compare with pictures in Ingzao Fa-Shi of a 5-component bracket set. Of course, the same kinds of bracket sets are constructed in the Qing dynasty, but they're also constructed earlier. There's a very unusual feature that I have never seen any place but here. It's called a chandu. It translates as cicada belly, and I'm looking at the little grooves right here and right here. I put my label here because I didn't want you to think that you were looking at a piece of the fan. This is a decorative feature on a brace. It is described in Ingzao Fa-Shi. Of course, it can be built later. So that's a building that I think should become part of our newly revised history. The other reason that mosques are interesting is because they show us how Chinese architectural space is accommodated to Muslim worship, or how Muslim worship is accommodated to Chinese architectural space. So the famous mosque in the city of Quanzhou, in the city of Guangzhou, the city that used to be called Canton, has a minaret that soars 37 meters. There is no reason to think that anyone wanted to conceal that this is a minaret. It's described in a 12th century record called Ting Shi, Jottings by My Bedside Table by a literatist named Yue Ke. But look what happens to the plan. So here's our mosque. Here's a monastery we looked at yesterday in Datong from the 11th century. We have a gate, T-shaped approach. We have a gate. Here it's a hall. This is our mosque, and this is our mihrab. So in order to pray, somebody has to make a 90-degree turn, another 90-degree turn, and faces the mihrab. Whereas here, we have our large approach platform that just leads us to 5 Buddha statues. But one has to go through 2 courtyards, and only then, in a building which is Chinese structures, we saw that, which is Chinese structures rebuilt, but Chinese structures fully, only at that point, concealed deep within several layers of Chinese architecture, does he worship. Now, the reason I wanted to show that to you is so that I could show you what happens here. There is no question that this is a pagoda for the practice of Lamist Buddhism. There's no question that a Nepali named Anige was in charge of the construction, or that it was built between 1272 and 1288 under Kublai's rule. But look at, there's also no question that the technique of making a structure that was cylindrical, made of brick, and then whitewashing it existed. But look at the plan, a kind of small hall, an enormous pagoda following a gate. We, of course, saw this plan across East Asia in the 6th century. We saw it in China, we saw it in Korea, we saw it in Japan. The pagoda and the gate are in reverse position. But this is a simple monastery with just 2 main structures with a gate in the front. So again, we're looking at the incorporation of a religion from outside of China into our Chinese plan. This building also figures prominently in my revisionist history. This is the Chinese Observatory in Dongfeng, Henan. It has been considered evidence of the impact of Western architecture in Yuan, China. What you see rises 17 meters. Like all observatories in China since the time of the legendary emperors, a major purpose was to regulate the calendar. The process for achieving a regularized calendar dates back to the dynasty called Zhou, to the 1st millennium BCE, and the process in the Yuan dynasty is recorded in a text called Shou Shi Li, issued in 1280 and translated in this book by my colleague Nathan Sivan. The observatory in Dongfeng is the oldest one that's extant in China. It's also the first for which we can confirm the presence of West Asians alongside Chinese observers. We also know that there were 8 Chinese officials who were involved in the observatory project, Guo Shoujing on the left, and a man named Wang Xun, who I don't have a picture of, but 1235 to 1281, both had background in math and in the sciences. Liu Bingzhong on the right, Kublai's advisor and equivalent to a prime minister for Kublai, a man first and primarily educated as a Chinese official, as were the other 5 men who worked on this. Kublai is almost definitely the person who, Liu Bingzhong is almost definitely the person who told Kublai all the benefits of building an observatory in terms of the symbolism for Chinese rulership. He's the man who designed the city that is Shangdu, based on the 8 trigrams of the I Ching. He's the man who designed the capital city Dadu, based on the classical text in the Rituals of Zhou that describes a ruler's city. On the other side, we have this evidence. We have names of 4 West Asians who were involved in astronomy in the western regions and who came to China at this time. First, Nasser al-Din al-Tusi, who convinced Hulagu, that's Kublai's younger brother, who was already in Iran, to build an observatory near the town of Maragah, that's in Azerbaijan, northern Iran, in 1279. Most influential, according to the records, Jamal al-Din, Chinese Jamal al-Din. He has a biography in Yuan and a biography in Rashid al-Din's History of the World. He began his career as an astronomer in Maragah. He eventually comes to China and enters Kublai's service. Jamal ad-Din is often credited with bringing 7 astronomical instruments to China in the year 1267. These are not the instruments he brought. These are pictures one finds on the web for what 6 of these instruments could have looked like. They included an armillary sphere, a tequitrum, sundial for unequal hours, sundial for equal hours, celestial globe, terrestrial globe, and astrolabe. Rashid wrote that Munka, Kublai and Hulagu's older brother, and the predecessor as Kagan, I'll go through this in a minute. This is just, I've been talking about these names. I'll show you how the family tree looks. That Munka wanted Jamal to build an observatory for him. The task was too difficult. That's at least what Rashid tells us. Jamal came to China. Nasser al-Din went back to work for Munka. And then later, Shams al-Din, who dies in 1322, I don't have his picture, a man trained in mathematics and astronomy, and Mir Muhammad, also no picture for him, worked on the observatory in Maragah and then came to China. So Chinggis, of course, his second Mongol ruler, his successor and his successor, the youngest sons, oldest son Munka is the 4th ruler. Now Kublai will be the 5th. He's gone to the east. He builds his capital in Dadu. Hulagu, the 3rd son, goes to the west, and he becomes responsible for what's known as the Ilkhanate in today's Iran and border regions. The 6th and 7th rulers and architecture relevant to them also will come up. So, our observatory. The Yuan, the standard history of Yuan, refers to the building that you're seeing here as Gaobiao. That's why I've got the characters on the screen, which we can translate as tall gnomon. I think the word gnomon is better for astronomy than tall marker. Yuan tells a reader that Kublai planned to build 5 Gaobiao in 5 different cities, but only the one in his capital, Dadu, and the one in Dongfeng at the foot of the Sacred Central Peak. Sacred Central Peak came up in the first lecture. The central point in China, at least symbolically, this is where one might expect an observatory. Those are the only 2 constructed. This feature, Gaobiao, is one of the 3 key features. So just to show you what is important, so we have essentially stairs that lead us to the top. We have a platform, about 1/3 of it is roofed. This marker, post, is very important. And this is how it worked. This pole here is called the Gaobiao. It was perpendicular to the post, and it was perpendicular to the measured marker here. The sun cast its ray. It made a shadow. Officials recorded where the shadow was. They knew what they were looking for the season, and thus the calendar was confirmed. The Gaobiao is the key defining device for an observatory in the Yuan dynasty. As far as we know, there was no Gaobiao at any earlier time in China. As far as we know, there was no Gaobiao in Iran. If one were to be excavated at Maragah, this would be fantastic evidence of interchange, but for now we have this only in China. This Gaobiao rose about 17 meters to the top of the building that you see, and as I said, is the crucial feature in assessing all other observatories during the period of Mongolian rule. Now, Giovanni in his Tawarikh al-Jahangusha and Rashid in his History of the World, Jami al-Tawarikh, discuss the observatory in Maragah. This is the kind of reconstruction one finds today on the web. We don't know that it looked like this, As at Dadu and at Dongfeng, instruments were moved to Maraga, in this case from Alamut, after that city was taken by Hulagu. I should say today there's a modern observatory there. If you look up Maraga on the web, you see a dome structure, and people can go there and look at the heavens. It's not certain that there was an observatory at Alamut, but many believe there was. It did have a famous library whose contents also were taken to Maraga by the Mongols. It's been argued that, as in China, the purpose of the Ilkhanate Observatory was more astrology than astronomy, and that a second purpose was to regulate the calendar. According to Rashid al-Din, the astronomical tables of the Ilkhans that were produced at Maraga, now I'm quoting, showed a deep knowledge of the Chinese calendar and Chinese sources. Now, one has no idea how to assess this kind of statement, but from it, perhaps this means that the Chinese duodenary cycle was adopted by the Ilkhans. It's a possibility. Unfortunately, there is very little evidence on the site. This plan, made in 1979 by Parviz Vardiavand, was sent to me by my colleague and at one time travel partner in China, Sheila Blair, who's in the audience. I thank her for this. This is, as far as I know, the best rendering, maybe there's something we don't know about yet, for what was in Maraga. But the texts tell us that there was a domed building, a library, a school for training observers, and a mosque. The domed building is not particularly significant. Domes are characteristic of Ilkhanate architecture for a variety of functions. But J. Samsho remarks that the observatory appears to have been subsidized in a manner ordinarily reserved for schools, hospitals, and libraries. Well, schools, of course, are highly significant with a long history, both in the Islamic world and in China. I thought about showing the White Deer Academy, but on the left, you're looking at a madrasa. On the right, we're looking at a plan, a very stylized plan of an academy from the Song dynasty. China, however, has a much longer history of training of officials. It goes back to the dynasty called Zhou that I just mentioned, when there were three significant structures of kingship, what I like to translate as the numinous hall. I think that Maspe Rose, the first one who used this term, for the Mingtang, the jade ring moat for the Biyong, and the spirit altar, or Lingtai, which housed functions that included the rituals of the 12 moons of the year, platforms for observation of the heavens, and also the Biyong for the education of officials. And some believe that these functions were put into a composite building at the very beginning of the 1st century CE by a man named Wang Meng, who briefly usurps the Chinese throne. The platforms for observation in his reconstruction that you're looking at here are on the corners, and then one would stand there and look to the heavens. On the left is what the platform for the observation of heavens at a later capital from the Han Dynasty looks like. We're still in the 1st or 2nd century CE, and then on the right, the way it's been reconstructed. As I mentioned, presumably Liu Bingjung suggested to Kublai that he build observatories because of these associations with Chinese kingship. But they go back, as I'm mentioning, to the same period when the texts that Liu was using for the designs of Kublai's capitals date, that is, the last millennium BCE or 1st millennium CE. As for the educational hall, Aydin Saili, a historian of Islamic astronomy, writes, again, it's roughly a quote, "There is no evidence that any observatory earlier than the one in Maraga had a library of any significance. Yet the next Ilkhanate observatory, which is in Sham, a western suburb of Tabriz, commissioned by Khazan Khan, who rules 1295 to 1304, who had visited Maraga, his observatory has a hospice, a hospital, a library, academy of philosophy, fountain, pavilion, 2 madrasa, and his own mausoleum." you see where I'm headed. We now have an observatory with the educational and ritual structures that have existed in China for a very long time. The Dadu Observatory has no remains from the period of Mongolian rule, but it's described in text and it's been reconstructed like this, and it is believed to have had the same two towers, one of which survives today in Dongfeng. This, it's lettered in the article I read, what was inside of this, and included in my quadrilateral here are a building complex for offices of the 5 seasonal officials, astrologers and their assistants, calendar clerks, the observatory director and observers, supervisor of water clocks and timekeepers, buildings for the acquisition of provisions, instruments, and supplies, a room for star maps, the spherical sky globe, a model of the sky, a carriage cover, libraries in which were contained astrology books and also books in math and computational astronomy, a building where almanacs were printed, buildings for teaching and preparing offerings for the shrine, a school for education in mathematics. In other words, schools of higher learning existed both at the observatories in Maraga and in Dadu. In the case of China, we have to consider that Kublai had largely eliminated the academy for training officials so that entry into something like the observatory might have been a way to ultimately enter the bureaucracy. But we have these very parallel kinds of buildings in both places. The best evidence for the impact of West Asian astronomy on China during the period of Mongolian rule, I would suggest, are the astronomical instruments that were brought to China. Evidence of the impact of Chinese astronomy in Iran under Ilkhanid rule is the adoption of the Chinese duodenary calendar, and Chinese also definitely worked in Maraga. We have no evidence of the tall gnomon anywhere but China. Both Willy Hertner and Aden Saili argue that Jamal ad-Din was neither a great astronomer nor erudite, and Hertner makes the stronger statement that Chinese astronomy did not undergo any essential change through this contact with Islamic science. Very strong statement. The architecture, I think, supports it. Unless one can prove the existence of a Galbiao in Iran, the setting of the calendar there is the main reason, I think, to see the Chinese process coming to that part of the world. Now, when we look at the plan, our plan comes right out of China. We saw a building from the Song Longxing Monastery yesterday. It's the one that Liang Sicheng described as making him feel he was walking into a Chinese painting. And we've seen this monastery also. So a main building, 2 smaller flanking pavilions, main building flanking pavilions, and a few other buildings on the axis. In other words, we might be looking at architecture that doesn't look like what we would expect to find with our ceramic tile roof eaves and our pillars and our bracket sets, but it is consistently put into a Chinese plan. As for the construction, the brick construction, in the 14th century, Chinese were building what were known as beamless halls, that is, halls without wooden beams. You're looking at one from Nanjing on the top, but the Chinese built brick tombs at least as early as the 2nd century CE, and of course the Chinese built brick pagodas in the 6th century. To the extent that this building appears distinctive among other 13th century buildings, I think it is probably because it was a highly specialized structure with a highly specialized function. Next, in our revisionist history, this building that I think people have looked at since you saw it on the poster, it stands in Yuan County, same county of the central capital, about midway between Chengdu and Dadu. It is referred to in the geographical study of this part of Inner Mongolia, it's in Inner Mongolia, that was undertaken by the request of the Qianlong court, undertaken by an official named Jinzhi Zhang sometime between 1732 and 1741, published with additions by Huang Kerun in 1758 and 59, 1758/59, It's not exactly certain which of those 2 years. It's called Kobe Santing-ji, the record of the 3 areas of Kobe. At that time, the area was known as Chahar. Sometimes you see it listed as Chahar, Kobe Santing-ji. The territory in question was part of the appanage of Empress Dowager Chengtian, 932 to 1009, of the Liao dynasty. She was regent for her son Shenzong, whose tomb paintings we saw yesterday, after her husband died in 982. In 986, when Shenzong ascends the throne, she's awarded these lands. They remain her appanage. She spends her summers and perhaps more of the year here every year until she dies. This book refers to it as Shu Zhuang Lo, that is comb and makeup tower, probably a reference to the fact that the lands were controlled by a woman. Sometimes you hear this building referred to as Shiliangge, West Cool Pavilion. Ge, pavilion, probably refers to the fact that there is a dome there. Jin and Huang, our 18th century authors, tell us that Shu Zhuanglo was squarish, brick-faced, more than 2 zhang, in other words, nearly 13 meters high, and had a semicircular dome rising from the center of a flat roof. This is certainly the building that we're looking at. The front entry was in the southeast with a window, that's on the left, and there was a window at the back, that's on the right. This is certainly what one sees today. There is also an interior dome. It's made of bricks that are 35 by 5 by 1.75 centimeters. The interior is divided into 8 sections, and the corners of those sections are decorated like this. And we have a more elaborate version here at the Phoenix Mosque in Hangzhou from the Yuan dynasty. The source, of course, could be bracket sets. The source also could be our Islamic muqarnas. But the interior clearly suggests to us that we are in the Islamic world. There are no paintings or images of humans or animals. And in the back, if one stood on the site when I was there last summer, there were remains of other buildings. Wang Beichun, 1921 to 1966, saw this building in 1993 and again in 1995. At the time of his death, 1996, as I mentioned, he was working on a paper that was completed posthumously by a colleague based on conversations in his hospital bed. Now, we all have images of scholars working literally till the day they die. Wang Beichun was doing this, and he was telling a colleague his thoughts about this building. I think we're going to understand why. I think now that I understand why. Wang Beichun was convinced that in spite of the associations with a Liao ruler, this was a Yuan structure. And Lin Mei-Tsuan, who's a name that some of you know, one of the archaeologists/historians of the Yuan period in China, published a set of essays in which he reiterates these ideas in 2007. By that point, the site had been excavated. So if you stand here and you look down here, Wang Beichun did not know what he would see, but there is a male and there is a female at either side. There's a kind of makeshift museum inside this structure, brocade clothing with gold decoration, other textiles, also ceramic tiles. Whose tomb is this has become part of a fairly heated controversy, and I believe that Wang Beichun anticipated this. The location gives us reason to believe that these were the lands of a man named Ananda, and I am convinced of this. Wang's suggestion supported by Lin Mei-Tsuan. Ananda was Prince of Anxi. This is why I showed you the plan of a city called Anxi Wangfu that I said was built for Kublai for his son Mongala. Mongala was a devout Buddhist. He gave his son the Buddhist name Ananda, but Ananda actually converted to Islam. When Kublai's successor, Timur, the sixth ruler, with Chinggis as the first, died, Ananda was in line for succession. He had been a successful general, and Timur's widow supported him. But his opponents were two brothers whose names were Kaishan, who will become the seventh ruler, and Ayurbarda, who becomes the eighth, great-grandsons of Kublai, but more direct descendants of Timur than Ananda, who was actually his cousin. Ananda also lacked support in Dadu, and in 1307 he was executed in order to make way for the succession of Kaishan. When Kaishan comes to rule, he builds the central capital. He builds it in Guyuan, in the same region where this building stands, as if to make it very clear, Ananda may have had power at one time, but he has now appropriated all the lands of Ananda, and whenever he goes between Dadu and Shangdu, he's going to stop here. But not on site are these pieces of stele with the characters Kuli Chi Se or Xiang Kuli Chi Se. So that's what you're looking at here, Xiang Kuli Chi Se. You can, if you look at the right website, you can see that there was a CCTV program that showed, and on the right, I assume this is Mongolian, right? People who read Mongolian can tell me if this says Xiang Korguz, Prince of Jining, who received the posthumous title Zhongxiang. Xiang Korguz was a Mongol, but not a Muslim. Now, to me, the architecture is proof that we are looking at a Muslim mausoleum. In fact, we are hard-pressed to find anywhere in China that any Mongol was buried. They're buried in unmarked locations. They're buried deep underground. We don't have tombs of Mongols in China. But I think we all know that archaeological sites can become political arenas. And a similar case comes to mind in the year 2010. This empty tomb was published. It's in the Zutong Mountains of Nanjing. And the excavators said, well, it's in a cemetery of Buddhist and Taoist eunuchs. There's a good reason to think this is the tomb of Zheng He. Zheng He, this is published. You can find all this on the web is great now. You don't even have to find the periodicals. If somebody wants to Google it, you will find this. Until 2010, Zheng He's mausoleum, Zheng He, of course, was a Muslim. Ma Sanbao, the famous seafarer, who maybe died at sea, had this as his mausoleum in the Neosho Mountains, a different mountain range outside of Nanjing. Now, I stood at this site with my colleague Sheila Blair on June 26 of 2013. And on July 10th of 2013, someone who knew I was interested in this received this picture as a cell phone transmission, who sent it to me in less than 3 weeks. Somebody had come to the site. You remember I showed you the remains. So there were, by that point, 4 mausolea, our dome on square construction. And this is now being presented as a Mongol cemetery in China. If anybody goes back to Guyuan this summer, I don't know what you're going to find. But I now know anyway why Wang Bei-chun so definitely wanted Ananda's name to come up in the literature, because it's really, I think, an extremely important argument. Now, there's physical evidence, there's architectural evidence for what this should be. This is the tomb of Tukulk Timur. It's in Ili or Amalik or Huacheng. This is yet another one of the remains of cities that I showed you at the beginning in western Xinjiang. It's a vaulted structure. It's more complicated than the tomb of Ananda. I'll call it the tomb of Ananda. 15.5 meters across, 15.5 meters high, 6.8 by 7.7 in the base dimensions. Tukulk Timur was a 7th generation descendant of Chinggis. He came to power in the Chagatai Khanate in 1346, converted to Islam 1347. Some 160,000 of his khanate converted in 1352. Upon his death, the western lands of the khanate fell to Tamerlane. The Chagatai Khanate ceases to exist. Anyone who has studied this mausoleum makes the immediate and correct comparison with the mausoleum of Buyan Kuli Khan, dies in 1356, also a Chagatai Khan, in Bukhara. Similar mausolea for two Chagatai Khans who die within 7 years of each other are to be expected. They both had ceramic tiles on the front. So now I'm putting our mausoleum next to it, and the source of Buyan Kuli Khan's mausoleum and Tukluk Timur's is often the mausoleum called the Tomb of the Samanid in Bukhara, dated 943. Both of these should be sources for what we have, and now I'm showing you, again, a close-up. It's not a very good picture, but there were ceramic tiles excavated on the grounds of the Guyuan mausoleum, and presumably the front of it at least was faced like this. Another mausoleum, another structure that has to be related to this is what you're looking at here in Karakoto, Chinese Heicheng in Inner Mongolia, a brick structure with an undecorated exterior. This is one of the pictures from the Kozlov expedition in the 1920s, but it again has your dome on a square, corner pillars, which are interesting, and then the extension in the front like we have in Tukluk Timur's tomb. Some people say because of where it is that it's a Shishia mausoleum. I think we are again looking at a Muslim tomb from the period of Mongol rule. But just to emphasize that I still haven't shown you anything that the Chinese were not able to do, on the left I am showing you a pagoda in Anyang County of Hunan. If you go to the Shang tombs in Anyang, you won't see this. It's difficult to find. It actually, I didn't find it the first or second times I looked. It was an extraordinary trip to find it, but it has a sway date. It is a dome on a square, and the entire exterior is faced. That's not to say that whoever built the tomb in Guyuan had seen this. That's to say that the technology and even a very similar structure existed in China in the year 600. This site also has not been considered in histories of Yuan architecture. I'm in Zhenglan Banner of Inner Mongolia. The place is called Sheep Group Temple, Yangchun Miao. It's about 40 kilometers as the crow flies from Shangdu. So far, 4 mounds have been found, like you see here. This is an old picture. Originally, there was a statue in front of each mound. The 4 are supposed to be on a line. I actually haven't been here, but these have to have been a ritual site for the Mongols. They were definitely constructed in the Yuan dynasty. The statues have been removed, and there are probably at least 60 statues like this. These two, this is left and right, are the same statue, and the one in the middle is a different one. These two at one time were just open air in Shangdu. Most of them have been moved to museums. On the left is one in the National Museum in Ulaanbaatar, and I want you to notice it's much less decorated. This is one that was found in Russia. It comes from a Russian publication. These are usually just called stone men. And the source are the stone men that one finds across Mongolia, often holding a cup and sometimes now decorated for contemporary worship. But what I want to point out and make a parallel to architecture is that the ones that are in the Chinese sphere of Mongolia have this kind of very elaborate decoration. It would be another lecture to prove it, but I think we are looking at Chinese craftsmen, just as we've looked at Chinese builders, taking buildings out of context and putting them into Chinese framework. And this is a piece of, this was inset into a corner at Shangdu, at Kublai's upper capital in Inner Mongolia. So Mongols say that these are not royalty. Almost all of them have lost their heads. The one I showed you in Ulaanbaatar still retains its head. They say these are elite but not royalty. I don't really know who they are, but we're now finally getting to the point where we are outside the Chinese sphere. So the last site I show you is this one, Bayanyao in Inner Mongolia. It is a set of grottos in the Ordos. There are about 65 caves. They're carved into natural rock. There are 26 pagodas carved onto the faces of these cliffs. 25 are of the Nepali-Tibetan style that you see here. Excavated material dates from Northern Wei, Xixia, that is the Tanguts, and the Yuan dynasty. The most extraordinary cave is this one, and it is a central pillar cave. That's what you're looking at on the lower left. Central pillar caves, of course, date to the 5th century, if not the 4th, in China and in Western China. The walls are covered with tantric or Lamist Buddhist imagery, both deities and also, as you see on the lower right, secular imagery. The tantric imagery finds comparisons all over China. So here's Bayanyao here. These are the famous Mogao K465 with tantric imagery. Feilai Feng in Hangzhou, this is what I referred to at the beginning as the tantric caves or Mongol period caves that we find from Hangzhou to Gansu, and this is the cloud terrace at the famous pass, the pass at the Great Wall, Zhuyongguan. So we are certainly looking at Lamaist Buddhism. This painting is on the walls of our central pillar cave. It is extraordinary. The Japanese have suggested that we're looking at Chinggis, his 4 sons, and then perhaps women, perhaps priests, and then princes of the blood. I like that interpretation. Peoples of Mongolia don't like it. Their point is that Chinggis would never be seated cross-ankled like this, that this must be a priest, it must be religious. Again, there's a lot of material that's coming up very rapidly for research here. And this is also on the walls. I was not shown this, but I know it's on the walls. And the Japanese call this the Chinggis mandala. Do with that name what you like, but it is a representation, it is a portrayal. I don't like to use the word portrait, but we do have paintings on the walls of these caves that give us human portrayals that people should be looking at in comparison to other pictures of Mongols to see if we can go a little bit further in our understanding of portraiture under the Mongols. What you see opposite the site today is this. It's a contemporary site for worship among the Mongols. So, the borders of Chinese architecture. The buildings that you see here, building in the center, constructed in Korea in the 13th or 14th century, the building and reconstruction at the top, Korea in the 6th century, below Japan in the 8th century, and Japan again in the 11th century. We do not find buildings like you see here except in East Asia, China, Korea, Japan. We don't find them in Mongolia. We don't find them in Western China. Were the Mongols, by their highly selective borrowing, finally the ones who defined the borders of pre-modern Chinese architecture, and did Islam play a role in the definition of the borders? 4 questions have been behind these lectures. Why does Chinese architecture appear to change so little over such long periods of time? Why is the Chinese building system so simple? Why did builders of empires and cities and magnificent structures from Inner Asia to Japan turn to the Chinese construction system? And are these questions particularly relevant to periods of non-native rule? The first and second questions, and so this is my question here, have we finally reached the borders when we come to the Islamic world or we come to Mongolia? The first and the second questions and their answers are interrelated. The Chinese building system has been resistant to change because continuity is readily achieved through simplicity. The straightforward forms offer the utmost means of ensuring that a building is identifiable as Chinese, and thus that China is identified. Entry into China is announced by its architecture of the ceramic tile roofs projecting above fortified walls. In response to the third question, why builders at the borders who aspire to power take on this system, Chinese architecture is easy to construct. There's nothing ambiguous about the power it represents, and the fact that it is a closed system, which can be argued, but I'll still call it a closed system today, enhances its value. Conquerors remember it, aspiring empire builders use it in the face of those conquered. The conquered watch it rising under the direction of new patrons. 6th century builders saw Chinese architecture in the form of Han commanderies. Khitan saw it in the conquest of the Parhe and in China. Mongols saw it in the Xixia and Jurchen territory. Long before they ever got to China, they also probably saw it in Khitan buildings in Mongolia. As for the last question, the more rulers or contenders there are, the more occasion there is to implement or adopt the system. Whereas in Han, there were only 2 great capitals, and except for the 15-year interregnum, 4 centuries of rule by one family. In ages of disunion or non-Chinese rule, the success of the Chinese architectural system was repeatedly tested. The success is validated by the continued use both in China and beyond the borders. The 6th century may parallel an age of late antiquity. The Khitan may have constructed pagodas in the name of Buddhism and erected tents around them, and the architectural landscape of the Mongolian Empire may have been described by Europeans. But in all 3 contexts, and in Sung and in Ming and in Qing, Chinese architecture distinguished itself from that of every other part of the world. Once inside these worlds, China built as China, but those who built China outside of China did not necessarily replace the building materials of their homeland. This came up yesterday in Eugene Wong's remarks. He had read all 3 lectures. Today's where I say it. So yes, we can use the local materials, but we still have our post and lintel system. If we could ever see what stands at Shazan-Kot, we might well be looking at a timber frame building in stone. In the Khitan period, these structures, or here another example, the buildings, whatever they look like, are put into standard Chinese plans there and also here in the 6th century, continuing, as we just saw, into the Yuan period. In the Khitan period, they were implemented into protectorate relationships. This desire from beyond China to build as China may be the most remarkable feature and feat of the Chinese building system. Anomalies can be absorbed by the overlay of China, so that changes in bracket set style or pagoda are always possible. A Chinese building or building complex is still ever identifiable, easy to imitate, and readily accessible to anyone who wants to build it. In these lectures, architecture has defined the borders. For in every period we've looked at and any that we might have replaced them with, architecture reminded people at the borders that China was the prize. Now, had there been a 4th lecture, I'm not sure I would have agreed with what I've said here, so I have to bring in the Manchus. The Manchus, in fact, did not subscribe to this policy of always building in China like China. They built at Chengde what you see on the left. They tried to bring in the architecture of the people they conquered into their own land, and in fact, this did not give them the lasting conquest of Inner Asia that they aspired to. Muslims, on the other hand, even while they fought the Qing government to the death in the 18th centuries and 19th centuries in Ningxia and in Gansu, continued to build mosques, as you see on the right, in Chinese style as recently as 2003. In fact, this use of China continues. It seems to have worked for everybody except the Manchus. And I predict that the building you see here will be in future government-sponsored publications of Chinese architectural history, because whoever is buried here, it's evidence that in the past as today, if not 56 ethnicities, many ethnicities and all their architecture comes into the Chinese sphere. Modern constructs such as borders, acculturation, assimilation, diffusionism, heliocentrism, or colonialism are all considerations when civilizations meet and one borrows or appropriates cultural models from the other. There is no century during the last 20 when men and women did not cross Asia in the name of commerce, religion, adventure, or conquest. There's also no century during this period when the borders of most of those peoples did not change. Thus, it is all the more impressive that builders in 19th century China notched perishable beams and joined them into holes and grooves to make buildings in the manner of buildings of circa 5000 BCE. Logic may suggest that the rise and fall of dynasties and kingdoms who enacted war and governance across more than 10 million square kilometers should have had numerous building systems. The physical record tells us that there was primarily one. This week, I've called it China's, for its endurance played such a large part in why China endured. Thank you. I just decided to finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a terrific tour de force and a real peroration there at the end, which we'll find in a future version of these lectures, which we may hope to publish, as is very often the case in the Reischauer lectures. We have two discussants who are now going to be asked to perform the impossible task of compressing their original remarks into approximately 7 minutes each. Our first discussant is Professor Wei-Chung Lin from UNC Chapel Hill, did his PhD at Chicago. I'm going to be brief here. I have a longer intro, but I won't do this. Wrote a book, a thesis on Mount Wutai, which was published, or is published this year, University of Washington Press, Building a Sacred Mountain at Mount Wutai, Buddhist Monastic Architecture in Medieval China. And he does a lot of work also in urban design and planning in pre-modern and modern China. Our second speaker, Professor Janet Gyatso, Hershey Professor of Buddhist Studies at the Divinity School, also in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations here. She's the author of many, many books, most recently Being Human in a Buddhist World, an Intellectual History of Medicine in Early Modern Tibet, in which she is an authority. She teaches courses in Buddhist history, ritual ideas, Tibetan studies, literature, both in FAS and at the Divinity School, and she leads a new program called the Buddhist Ministry Initiative at the Div School. She is here speaking actually for Professor Leonard van der Kuyp, who was the original discussant, as you saw, I'm sure, in our materials. For personal reasons, Professor van der Kuyp suddenly is unable to attend. He's out of the country, and Janet has very graciously agreed to give the remarks prepared by Leonard on his behalf. So first, Professor Lin.
Well, thanks, Mark. I don't think I can speak as fast as you can, but I will try my best. Let me get my slides real quick. I only have a few things I want to show. Well, yeah, I will try to be disciplined. Try to compress my commentary in 7 minutes. But so the first of all, I want to thank the Professor Eugene Wang for his kind invitation, as well as Mark and Lydia of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies for making my visit possible and enjoyable. As an Chinese architecture historian myself, after sitting in the audience for the 3 consecutive talks in 3 days, I have to say I'm completely overwhelmed by the breadth of Professor Steinhardt's scholarship. These lectures provide us with conceptions and frameworks for understanding the history of Chinese architecture, with a great amount of evidence that sketches a contour of the building tradition on a shifting and expanding cultural map of pre-modern China. The third lecture of the series, A Revisionist History of Yuan Architecture, deals with the building legacy of what Professor Steinhardt calls the Yuan century from 1267 to 1368, the century of Mongolian reign in Chinese history. In the grand scheme of the lecture series, this last talk will serve the purpose of demonstrating how Yuan architecture, despite its non-Chinese cultural background and diversity, was built to negotiate with China's long-standing architectural tradition and unique building system, one of the themes that stream together all three lectures. Yet it also raises questions different from those of the previous two lectures. Following the structure of today's presentation that we have just heard, I will also begin my discussion with the standard history of Yuan architecture, followed by the revisionist one, as proposed by Professor Steinhardt. As we have just learned, the most eminent structure of the period in the Hall of Virtuous Tranquility, one of the main hall, I took the image from your slide, so the main hall of the Yongle Temple, and the humble structure of the earliest surviving winter house, and the stage building in Linfen, Shanxi, all timber frame structures, although different in scale and function, are grouped together in a category of Yuan architecture with discernible structural characteristics of the period, observable in such components as bases, pillars, bracketing, beams, seating, and so on. By now, it should be apparent that these are the components that built a post and lintel timber frame that has been the core of the Chinese construction since China developed its first building system. Yes, technology and stylistic features evolved over time, thus period styles can be discerned. But the building components and the principles that govern their relationships have been remarkably consistent, creating a style of architecture that is, in Professor Steinhardt's word, archetypal but not chronotopic. This timber frame unit, moreover, was so structural, straightforward, and adaptable that it lends itself to different reproductions and constructions that are able to cater to specific needs and various functions, be they palatial, religious, ritual, or residential. Chinese traditional wooden architecture in this regard is also non-typological. Now, questions may arise in this history of Chinese architecture. For example, one may ask, is this the only way of perceiving the art of China's building tradition? And are there any other meanings, cultural, religious, or political, that we can locate in and beyond this structural frame? These, of course, are questions open to debate. I, for one, will argue that there must be layers of significance that one can explore with the structural frame of the pre-modern architecture if specific contexts are given. Yet, in the broader scheme of Professor Steinhardt's three lectures, these questions seem to be off the point, since one still needs to deal with the fact that, regardless of type and function, so much Chinese architecture looks like so much other Chinese architecture in Professor Steinhardt's remark that were built in different times and spaces. Not only did the surviving evidence lead to this understanding of China's building history, as demonstrated abundantly in the three lectures, but the terms of analysis provided in the building standards, such as, that is, canonical texts, such as 营造法式, also facilitate an intrinsic view to the standard history. And it is in the very sense of the canonical view of that Yuan architecture can be defined and historicized in the standard history. Considered as such, every period in pre-modern China indeed has a standard history, but more critically, this history of the structural system that has endured for millennia, resisting changes and alternatives, is itself an important cultural phenomenon that begs for explanation and exploration of its cultural implication. For this, let me fast forward in time momentarily to 20th century. In answering the call to modernize the building tradition, Liang Sicheng, whose name we have heard for several times by now, advanced two what he called imaginary pictures of architecture, published in 1954. So you can see one on the right is you have the high-rise building, the other one you have the complex of the modern building in the Chinese feature. So these two pictures were intended to show the ways in which traditional Chinese architecture could be built into modern era by substituting timber with steel and reinforced concrete without changing its archetypal form. The resistance to change, even in a high-rise building of the 20th century, is both political and cultural, suggesting a Chinese view or perspective with which China could enter the modern era and encounter modernity, at least in Liang Sichen's mind. In this regard, the standard history of our discussion, to me, is more than a history of how a seemingly unchanged archetype of Chinese architecture evolved over time, but it actually reveals an intrinsic or interior viewpoint of China's building tradition in the sense of a closed system, discussing Professor Steinhardt's first lecture, that held the tradition together, both architecturally and culturally. In other words, to continue to build in this archetype in the 6th, 11th, 13th to 14th, or 20th century is a conscious decision that perpetuates its tradition within the system. In comparison, the revisionist history in today's lecture, as how I understand it, provides complementary and contrasting viewpoints that were outside and extrinsic from the perspective of Mongols. Indeed, the observatory, mosque, and domed mausoleum, among others, introduced in today's lectures, were building types that found no exact counterparts in China, but were built in Chinese architecture form and principle. From the viewpoint of the standard history, these are oddballs that don't fit the criteria and our expectation. Yet they were part of the effort of the Mongols to build as the Chinese did on China's soil when considered from a revisionist viewpoint. More than any other period, Yuan architecture arguably was built most strictly in accordance with the idea or the notion of rank prescribed in Chinese building system in regard to both its timber frame and layout of the building complex. By subscribing to the ranking system of Chinese architecture, the Mongols constructs their buildings through, though of different types and functions, that will exercise the hierarchy and authority embedded in that system. In this case, it presents a complementary viewpoint to the standard history. In the example of mosque architecture, in an example of how mosque architecture was built by adopting Chinese building vocabulary, the Mongols seem to have been more flexible in adhering to the canons, as seen in the changing of the orientation, narrowing of the floor plan, or modifying the structure details. So, are the mosques that we looked at today in today's lecture Chinese or Islamic? Perhaps both. But the very fact that Chinese architecture vocabulary could be modified and changed in different building syntax and context on China's soil also suggests a viewpoint that contrasts to the canonical view, thus perhaps subverting China's cultural authority in the building art if we follow the line of argument. So after all, when the Mongols took over China, they didn't bring with them a particular building tradition. And only after establishing their dynasty in China did they begin to realize and materialize the non-Chinese religions and ideas in architecture, as they had never done before. Yet they built in the building styles that they saw in China with their own purpose and intention as well as ambition. What I learned from the lecture today is that we can never fully understand the architecture of the Yuan century in China under the Mongolian reign with only one viewpoint without the other, that of the standard history and the revisionist one. And perhaps we can characterize Yuan architecture precisely in the dialectic relationships between these two views. And I hope Professor Steinhardt will agree with me. I began my studies in history of Chinese architecture in this country in 1997. And the first two articles I've read were both by Professor Steinhardt. The first one, Liao, an architectural tradition in the making, published in 1994, prior to the publication of her master work, Liao Architecture, in 1997. And the second one, Toward the Definition of Yuan Dynasty Hall, the topic related to today's talk, and published in 1988. and I learned a great deal from the two articles that start my career and have continued to benefit from Professor Steinhardt's work since then. And I'm grateful for it and indebted to her scholarship that has shaped my career. And I know I'm not the only person who feels this way among the scholars of my generation. So thank you for the very rich and the wonderful lecture, and I feel honored to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei Chao. We could bring up the house lights.
Well, it's a little daunting to have to condense this talk into 7 minutes when actually I just received it this morning and I barely even glanced at it. So I don't know what the main point of it is. So what I'm going to do is try to read as much of it as I can, and then you can just stop me. But actually what I'm going to choose to do before doing so is to get two of my own comments in. One of which I'm just wondering whether, the point that we've heard about when in China build as the Chinese do, I'm just wondering whether it's begging the question of what the word China means.
Janet, I'm going to suggest that you give your own comments, and we present Leonard's comments to Nancy in written form as you have them.
Okay, that's fine.
Let's do that.
And
Let's do that.
that will make it actually very, very
okay with
brief,
you?
in fact.
Okay.
Because I'm just taking in the material now and I hadn't heard it before. So I'm just wondering, what do we mean by the category of China? Certainly in Professor Lin's talk just now, it was very clear during the modern period, the clear nationalist and political agenda in these recent style of architecture. But can we just say, because people are building in what we might say the local style and maybe the style of prestige and great beauty and so on, does that mean that it's China per se? And is there a sort of a continuous thread that makes it China in all of those cases? So are we not sort of buying into maybe a contemporary retrospective view of what China even means? And to what degree are the Mongols Chinese or not is even a question that we might beg. So that was just a very, very general question, and I'm just worried about that. And so this will be very brief because my other question is just the sort of question that I would have raised from the floor. It's something I've wondered about for a very long time, which actually Professor Van der Kuyk does mention. The style of temples in the Kathmandu Valley, temples and other kinds of government buildings, does look, so some of those last pictures that you showed us that said, you don't see this kind of building in anywhere other than China, they look so much like, I mean, I'm not an expert again, and I couldn't talk about the details, but the way the roofs are, that's sort of, it's very, very familiar style from East Asia, and I don't know what the history of that is, and I don't know whether you can shed any light on that.
I'm not sure that Kathmandu has bracket sets, right? I think
I don't know about, I didn't notice the bracket sets, actually.
I know
And how
the
many
buildings.
there are.
I know the buildings you're talking about. There's general and there's specific. The
True.
first question I think is, worth talking about. I think Kathmandu may have braces like this, just straight, what you might almost call a cantilever piece of wood, like building in the Wild West, right? You have a pole, you have a roof, and you hold it up. I'm not sure they really do sophisticated bracket sets of any kind. Not sure. I think they probably have ceramic tile roofs.
What about your thoughts on that first question?
On
then?
the first
Yeah.
question, I think that first question, I hope it was implicit in all the lectures. My last comment, I've used China to define her borders, but what is China? Sometimes people in seminars play around with, what if we don't use the word China today? I mean, what if today in class we don't use the word China? What should we use? How do we define it? Can we define it only geographically? Can we define it, art historians, by cultural relics? And I can't really answer it, but it's a question, it's a serious question that deserves thinking about every time anybody writes anything or shows anything. I do think that the architecture is on some levels as simple as I pointed out to be. I think that's really one of the features of Chinese architecture that's overwhelmed me since I first began to look at it. Always, isn't there more here than just the post and the lintel and why? And I do think that this is something that China does and almost no other civilization does, certainly not another civilization that endures as long as China. I think that the most telling feature of the last few buildings that I...
sit down maybe,
I'll show you. I think the most telling feature of the last few buildings that I showed you, the observatory and the white tantric pagoda in particular, really are put in, and then the mosques, are really put in Chinese plans. And in a sense, you know, to talk about how my own entry into this field, the reason that I chose to work on Mongols way back when was because I assumed that I was going to finally find something that didn't look like China. That was my pre-assumption when I decided to write a dissertation here a long time ago. And in the text, there's even something called a lu ding. There's a flat roof, and people assume, okay, maybe these are roofs that you see on the step or something. But in fact, building after building, pieces, Chinese means of construction keep coming back. The observatory, the way that I showed it today, wasn't really what I thought about the observatory when I first looked at it. That's to me, one of the most exciting things about doing research. Often, you don't end up where you think you'll end up. I was sure that the observatory had to be Sino-Islamic. It was the best candidate. Just like the Lama's pagoda, of course, it's for Lamism. But it doesn't have to be enclosed by a wall with a gate in front with only one other building on that axis, which is a Buddha hall. There are other ways to build a pagoda. So it's conscious choice, or unconscious choice, but it's what happens. So I think, you know, I think your question is very serious. I think we all use the word China to mean many things. But I have let the architecture drive my conclusions. And I think that with my best evidence being the physical evidence, that's where I landed.
I guess, you know, one way to ask the question then, when you mention a conscious choice, so a conscious choice at the time by the builders.
Not necessarily the builders.
Or the designers.
Well, not
or the
necessarily
patrons.
The patrons.
Right.
But the patrons, I mean, you know, people aren't even sure that Kublai could read Chinese. It's not clear that he could speak Chinese. He had advisors, and he's in China. And he's probably living in a tent, and he's hanging animal skins on the walls of his tent within the wall after wall after wall after wall after gate. So he's living his semi-nomadic life in total privacy with the conscious choice of putting it behind Chinese walls. He's torn down a city. He didn't have to rebuild a city, but he chose to rebuild as Chinese a city as had ever been built before. So that's, I mean, I think the material evidence is what's informed me, I think.
Oh, right, and I understand
what
that
I'm
point, and it's
saying,
really
yeah.
fascinating. My question is that conscious choice, does that conscious choice or that conscious thought have in it some kind of concept or term called China? Is Kublai saying to himself, I am in
yes.
China and I should...
I mean, I can't speak for everybody. Go ahead, yeah.
So I'm in China and I need to build something or adhere to the Chinese custom? Or is he just saying that I'm in this place where there's a really interesting and important and very impressive kind of architectural tradition which has enormous symbolic significance and authority, and I want to participate in that because that is what has held authority here for a very long time. So I'm just questioning the very category of China itself, and that we're sort of projecting backwards, and it may well have been the case
So for
in the time of
I think it's the
Kublai Khan.
first, because Shangdu was built like China, and he wasn't even there yet. That was his decision to build this. I think your second alternative is the alternative that his advisors are giving him. I think men like Liu Bingjung, who I mentioned, said, and there's symbolic association. I don't think Kublai knew that he had a center marker for his city or that the walls were built equidistant, but I do think that when he approached China from afar the first time, he saw these walls, and he also saw all the tax revenue that he was going to collect, and this agrarian society who would feed him, and people who would make silk for him. I think he wanted China. That's what I think. I mean, it could be debated. That's what I think.
We will leave you the last word.
Oh, all right, great.
At least for right this moment. I'd like to suggest we carry the conversation out. We have, again, as before, a very nice reception prepared outside, to which everyone is invited. I have asked, I don't know whether it's happened, for sparkling wine to be made available for everybody. Thank you for coming to all three. We've had an excellent turnout this year, testament to the wonderful topic and the material that you've presented to us. I think that, if I may suggest, taking a line from your remarks, Borders of Chinese Architecture might be the title of the publication that I very much hope comes out of this, that it engages with the questions that have come up today, yesterday, and the day before.
That'd be
Nancy,
great.
thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was actually a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.